So hello and welcome back to another Improvement Season podcast. As always, for us, it was just a couple of seconds. For you guys, it was 1 week. And here we are. And as promised, this time we're going to talk a little bit more about training itself. So Steve, while I was down peeing, I was thinking that you've touched on one thing, and that is kind of changing things up in a mesocycle and thinking like, or contemplating rather, the idea of like, do I need to change something? And I was resonating with that because I am in the last couple of sessions of this mesocycle. And I was just thinking like, okay, do I need to make any kind of changes to my exercises and the exercise selection? And I've been running this split since a very long time with a very small modifications. But actually, things are feeling so productive, so good. I can push myself. I'm pushing at the highest intensity with each and every kind of exercise. I know what I'm getting into whenever I'm setting foot in the gym. And I think that Nathan PT once said it, that with training experience and age, you actually start to make less and less changes to then your training protocol and also the exercises that you're doing. And then if you make some changes, then they are very, very minor. And I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts around this, Steve, of the things that I've now touched on.
Yeah, I can see, I think we've talked about it maybe in the past, where I can see kind of two, either ends of the spectrum of when you're more advanced, you might require to make changes more. I could see someone arguing this. I'm not saying this is how I feel. You could require changes more frequently because kind of fatigue and staleness maybe pick up, like they might pick up more quickly than otherwise they would when you're kind of weaker, and you can see adaptations for longer with like certain exercises or splits or whatever. Whereas when you're more advanced, it might be that you pick up fatigue and staleness of movements more readily. So utilizing a little bit more of a higher level of novelty could help circumvent that potentially, I guess. But then on the other hand, I'm like, but it takes so long to see adaptations. If you don't hold an exercise for, or even a split for a long period of time, then how do you know that things are working? And so I'm like, actually, I think keeping things like you mentioned there, keeping things pretty steady for long periods of time and making very small tweaks to make sure that like you're not causing an injury and stimulus isn't really dropping off, essentially trying to keep SFR in a decent place, stimulus to fatigue ratio. I see that as better because then you can actually track trends. Whereas in the past, I've definitely been too ready to change exercises where I'm just like, oh, it's getting a bit tough. Like, it'd be nice to change an exercise. I've ran it for 2 to 3 mesocycles. And that way you're kind of chasing this novelty. Like, yeah, but are you actually adapting and improving? If you're adapting and improving, you have to run it and I guess you could argue on the other side again, well, what if you rotate that exercise back in later and then you can see if you've adapted and improved? But I'm just like, I kind of prefer running it for an extended period of time, making sure I've hit some PRs with it at least versus last time, and then rotate it at some point if it is getting stale, or just keep running it until truly the stimulus to fatigue ratio has got to a poor place where I'm just like super fatigued from it and it's just not giving me very good like pumps, disruption, those kind of biofeedback measures. So I think I once was in this kind of camp of, as I'm more advanced, making changes more readily and running novelty and using that to an advantage. Whereas now I'm like, actually, I prefer keeping things pretty static for an extended period of time because adaptations are so slow. That's kind of where I've got to with it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that to your point, and to be fair, to counter my point as well, to keep things static, I think that with training experience and age, you're probably also getting better and just like exercises in general. No matter what type of exercise it is that you're doing, you can probably get into it much, much quicker because you have that muscle memory effect of the skill that is then required of doing a specific movement. So we've talked about it in the past. Now, trying a back movement, I can nearly make every kind of back movement work wherever I wanted to work in my back. And this is something that I wasn't able to pull off in the past. And of course, this kind of counters the arguments that are brought up, because then you could also make the argument that it doesn't really matter that much of what it is that you're doing, because if you can exhaust the muscles with any kind of exercise, then exercise selection doesn't really matter, which I could see that this is actually a case. Now, do you then get the highest extent of a stimulus? Perhaps if you do then enough volume per session, I think then it equates to the same amount. But then also, of course, fatigue comes into play as well, where you're then accumulating more fatigue to receive the same stimulus because you had to do more to compensate for the lack of neurological and technical adaptations also. But yeah, I mean, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's a great counter. And I think probably, as with everything we kind of come to, you want to avoid the extremes. Yeah. Don't change things too often. Don't keep things stubborn and the same just for the sake of keeping it the same.
Yeah.
Everyone's sweet spot's going to be somewhere in the middle there. And ultimately, you could be favoring one over the other. It's whichever, so long as you're seeing progress over the long run with your exercises, you're seeing PRs occurring, you're probably fine. And you could, to say there's one, you must do it this one way, it's hard to even define. Yeah. So yeah, I think that was a good point too.
I do understand though that people sometimes question whether they have to change something because they've been doing one thing for such a long time. I totally get that, where it's like, should I really be like this? Is that now it for the rest of my training career? Am I now bound to doing the same movements over and over and over again? And I could definitely see that some people start to question their own approach, start to think that they may be missing out on something, and then they are looking for kind of the magic pill somewhere else. And or they can't really just stick with the same movements because they are the type of person who needs changes in their lives on a frequent basis. And I have it in other aspects of my life where I can't really stick with the same thing for too long. However, in training, I have no issues whatsoever with that. And that's why I'm just happy with keeping my split as it is and run it for as long as I can. And it doesn't get old. I like being in the gym. I like to, I don't know, be the person that I am in the gym. I don't have much interactions with people there, but because I'm always going at the same time, the people who also go at the same time, they know who I am because of that. And I don't know, I kind of like this. It sounds as if you're then predictable and all that kind of stuff, but I don't have an issue with that, to be honest.
Again, I think it comes back to, if you were just spinning your wheels doing this, I'd be like, Pascal, come on. Like, you got to make a change. But if you're progressing, go with it. Like, that's good. And progressing at a rate that's reasonable for your level of training age, go with it. Because obviously we're not fond of that. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Because that's like a poor man's way of logic.
Yeah. By the way, here today, I finished my training session, and there's this one guy I had a couple of chats with already in the past. And we were just there, and he was just, oh man, there's something that I don't want to hear. He didn't ask me whether I'm lifting or not. That's not the question. He was then asking like, yeah, but you're not trying to gain, right? Aren't you? You want to maintain on that physique. I was just like, no, I want to gain. And
why was he asking that?
Because I am, when I'm training, so I'm training 6 days per week. My training sessions, they last from like 40 minutes to an hour, depending on the type of session. For the vast majority of people out there, believe it or not, I know that you know it, Steve, but maybe the listeners don't. For the vast majority of people out there, they think that you have to be in the gym for like 1.5 hours, because otherwise a session isn't productive. Otherwise, it can't be a good session and all that kind of stuff. There's a connotation for length is equal to gains and productivity of a workout, which couldn't be further from the truth. I am even under the opinion that if you are well advanced and you take like, if it's not intentionally or you need that necessary, and you spend like 2 hours in the gym when you're training 6 times per week, and actually you're only doing like a total amount of 10 sets in the entire session, something is very wrong. Unless, of course, you are in a gym environment where you have lots of friends, you are at a place like Dust Gym, for example, where you're then training with other people, have lifting partners and all that kind of stuff, you know. But if you are in a kit. Yeah. But if you are in an environment like me, I'm going by myself to the gym. I'm always going at the same times. I know the machines. I have my running order. I know how much rest I need often between the sets as well. So everything is kind of a routine. And I know that I don't take longer than this. And there's no interruption because all of a sudden a friend is showing up when we have a chit chat and do, I don't know, kind of do use the same machine or so, right? I can do the machines that I want to use at that given time. I don't have to wait for someone else. And if you're in a situation like this, often the training sessions on a split that is then a 6-day split throughout the week, they shouldn't really take too long unless you're one of the poor souls who really need a lot of volume. And so many people are under the impression that if you're working out for less than an hour, it can't be productive. There is no chance, right? And you would be surprised, Steve, of how many people have already given me some kind of comment in the gym there of like, oh, Pascal, you're done already? Didn't you train? Something like this, right? Whereas I'm always responsive and saying like, no, I'm training 6 days per week. And I know how to actually get some productive sessions in. I'm not pissing away time. And this is also basically what I said to him, that I know what I need to do, and that's what I came here for without any kind of distractions. And I know how to switch on that gear in order then to bring the intensity, bring, like Ryan Doris said, bring the fire to be able to cook, right? Yeah. And if you don't bring the fire, you can't cook something or boil the water. And this is something that you see so often, that people are just kind of, maybe it's not always happening like this, but having their phone while doing something like calf raises is the perfect kind of symbol for or representation of how some people are training. Yeah. Right? And if you were to push it like very hard, you could go there in and out in like under an hour.
I know when I used to train, I would clock watch because I'd be like, every session needs to be an hour. So like, I was like, oh, I've got like 45 minutes in, I'm done. I was like, no, I have to train for 15 more minutes to extend. So I've done an hour. And even in my gym recently, there was a woman, she was like, yeah, I just heard her off. She was talking to someone. She was like, oh, I've got 5 more minutes for my workout. So I'm going to like, she was like, she was like, I have an hour. She trains for an hour. It isn't, she's trying to do a certain amount of exercises or a certain amount of volume or anything like that. It's like, she's like, that is her volume, is I train for an hour, I get as much done as I can in the hour. I'm like, oh, it's interesting. And that's kind of the difference between people who like exercise versus people who train. Like you have a program that you're trying to get done, whereas a lot of people just go and they're like, I have an hour to do as much as I like can in a sense. So I totally get that way. Like you said, a lot of our listeners will understand it, but a lot of Gen Pop, that is how they approach the gym, is like, let's see what we can get done in that time. I will say, possibly you also recover. I don't know if this is true, but whenever we've trained, you always get finished before me. Yeah.
I think I do recover very fast between the sets, which doesn't really, or which isn't really a beneficial thing that you want to have as a bodybuilder, because that probably also means that you're very good at, have a very good stamina. And often it also then means that you have those pathways that are not really beneficial for something like hypertrophy.
I just remember when we were in Das Gym, so like I was like, I had a few times where you were going in for another set and I was like, fuck, I'm not ready. My quads are still fucked. I can't go again.
If I could pick and choose kind of like a character that you have like an RPG game, and in the first stages, you're building your character, like what he looks like, his attributes. You have people who have like, I don't know, the sneaky ones who are better at kind of sneaking around, but they are not the strongest and all that kind of stuff. And if I could build myself, my character, I would definitely not give myself the attributes that I have right now. Because I'm more like a rogue, I would say, or like someone who's probably able to kind of sprint for a long time. Instead, I would like to be the tank who's just big and massive, but also couldn't really last a long time when he's running. That is the person that I want to be, and not the other one.
No, I totally feel you. And yeah, no, and so with your training now, you're coming through, how many weeks have you experimented with something recently? We haven't touched on it. So what was the thing you were experimenting with? It was training at a closer to proximity to failure for a longer period of time, right?
Yeah. And also there, possibly I'm adapting super quickly when it comes to this. Perhaps.
Okay.
Also, this is probably not even a good thing because you don't really want to become better at handling, for example, volume or so. You want to be still as sensitive to lower volumes as you can be, right? So that you don't need to introduce
efficient.
more or so. Exactly. You want to be inefficient instead of efficient. And this mesocycle has gone very, very well, though. I think it's more of an exception rather than that it is the rule, because we know that over the past years, I had plenty of times where I needed to call things early because a sickness was coming up. And this time I just had a streak, and I didn't get sick during that time as well, which is also something that didn't happen in a very long time. And yeah, so things just went particularly well. I pushed it up for 6 weeks now, and I'm only taking a deload due to the holiday. Otherwise, I wouldn't really probably need a deload right now, and I could even push on for a little bit longer now. But in the sessions themselves, I'm breathing heavily, especially. Steve, this is something that I'm curious about. On certain movements and lifts, do you feel kind of nauseous afterwards? And I'm not specific, so it's not so much the total amount of intensity of the workout, but more so very specific movements. And for me personally, it is especially the back movements, and also, and here it is, that is a very weird one, the tricep movements that I'm doing.
Weird. No, I can't say I particularly. It's if I go into the session feeling nauseous, that's normally what it is. Yeah. Recently, at least. But if I don't feel otherwise, no, I don't really get that. No. Yeah.
And it's especially like the tricep movement. And the one that I can always replicate that feeling is on the tricep cable overhead extensions. I don't know what it is. When I'm pushing close to failure or to failure, I'm always kind of like, oh, that was a tough one.
So with your experiment, what did week 1 look like? And then what have your progressions look like, if you can explain that?
So the RER was still staying the same, though, but I allowed myself to be just more aggressive with it and just really switch off in the sense of like, all right, if I exceed the RER, and instead of being 4 RER, it now turns to a 3 RER, that's all right. Or if there's a bigger drop in RER on a consecutive set basis, then that's all right as well. Whereas I always try to keep it at a very, very static RER before. So it could sometimes even look in the first week of like, okay, if there's a steep drop off in performance, first set was, let's just say, hack squats for 10 repetitions for 4 RER. And the second one is kind of pushing it all the way up to 9 repetitions. And all of a sudden it was already just a 3 RER, and then giving it just, or going more forward for the last one. And instead of allowing the reps to come down too much, hey, push a little bit harder. And then maybe it ends up being a 2 or 1 RER. And that was all right. I think in the end, there is no right or wrong way of doing things. We just want to be at a specific relative intensity for adequate amount of volume, and that's fine. And then over time, of course, trying your very best to add 1 repetition here and there and adding some load when the time is right. And so far, it has worked out to be that case. Sometimes I'm even surprising myself when today was a fantastically or a very, very good day where I went onto, for example, the machine lateral raises, and I was just like, all right, let me just try now 36 kilograms on that machine instead of 32, which is percentage-wise a very big jump. And it felt great. I was doing like 2 repetitions less than, so my target was 16 repetitions, which would have been like 1 more rep than the week prior to it. But this time I did 14 repetitions, but relatively speaking, with much, much more load, and I was very happy with that result, and it even felt good. So yeah, things are heading into the right direction. And then the next week, I'm trying once again to do them 15 repetitions at least on that one, and this way it's progressing quite nicely. And in the end, it's like I said, instead of being hyper focused on those metrics of like keeping RER static or so, being sometimes a little bit more flexible and allowing what then the day allows you for is the way to go. But to be honest also, and to be fair, I don't think that I would have been ready for this experimentation and this style of training a couple of years back, just due to maturity, due to then technique and execution and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger. Yeah, I know it was a lot of information. Do you have any kind of thoughts around this, Steve?
Yeah. The thing I settled on a while ago was like that week one, just kind of hitting some baseline good numbers that you know is reps in reserve, but is still hard. Yeah. And then just each week, just trying to beat it a little bit and not really considering reps in reserve too much after that point. So long as like, yeah, if I'm earlier within my mesocycle, I want to leave a few more. As I approach the end, it's like, I'm basically everything except failure, or like, well, I say failure, not reps in reserve. So at this point, I guess with the way you're doing it, it's like your average RER over time is just getting closer to failure. So it looks very similar, but it's like you're not keeping it static from week one.
That's a very good way of putting things. Yes, that's exactly it. Because I was already in my head thinking about, okay, how can I make it a little bit more, or visualize it to make it a little bit easier to understand so that it doesn't really come across like a random thing. You're going in there and you're just like hitting numbers, because that's not what it's like. And I think you have, of course, different ways of going about trying to get as close to the 4 RER, for example, in the first week as possible, or 3 RER, or whatever RER it is that you have with, for example, the reverse engineering method that I was already talking about. We have a video about this over on YouTube as well, so that you can pre-plan things and have like a target that should be very close to the given RER. If that's not enough for you, I think that the vast majority of people, and that is me, myself included, I rather want you to go beyond the RER target, because it is way likelier that you're undershooting the RER target than to overshoot it. Of course, there are different exercises, such as, for example, a bench press. I think there in that rare scenario, it is easier to overshoot it. It's like 4 RER, it doesn't really feel like 4 RER, and then all of a sudden, 0, right? And you can't really press it. Whereas on something like, I don't know, hack squats, leg press, you can push for so much longer most of the time. And I think that the vast majority of people are probably better off pushing it harder instead of, oh no, this was 4 RER, and then convincing yourself that this was it. I don't know what your thoughts are around this.
For me, the vast majority of people are better doing it that way. I don't know if my clients in general are better doing it that way, just because a lot of them are probably more likely to overshoot it than undershoot it, myself included. It kind of depends. I think a lot of people have that mentality of 3 or 4 RER is like easy, or they just have no idea what that is. So they can be miles away from it, which again, we see in the literature and you see in the gym all the time where someone's like, I'm just like, man, my 3 or 4 RER is harder than like what most people's working sets are in this gym. I'm just like, man. And you're completely right on leg training in particular. In the set itself, a 3 or 4 RER feels fucking like, it's just real hard. Like it just, leg training, when you're training hard for legs, it just is systemically just hard. It just is. Something I wanted to touch on though was your percentage increase. So you mentioned going from like 32 to 36, and actually your reps didn't drop off as much as what you might think. Do you sometimes find for more isolation-based movements that happens more often? Because I find for like compound movements, 2 to 3% equates to like 1 rep. So if I go up 10%, I expect like 3-4 reps to drop off. Whereas for isolation-based movements, it could go up 10%, but I might drop half the number of reps. It doesn't quite equate as well for isolation-based movements, where I outperform. I'm like, how am I adding 5 pounds to this movement that is only like 15 pounds and I'm managing to almost match reps? It doesn't quite work out as nicely as for compound movements.
Yes, I think yes, but it could very well be that I'm not considering certain movements now. But I do the same as you, Steve. On heavier compound lifts, or the more load you're using, the more I'm convinced that something like 2.5 kilograms of weight increment is equating to like 1 repetition.
Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward when it comes to this, which doesn't really always add up with smaller isolationist kind of movements. I think, though, that it's very much depend on your daily performance, because sometimes I would go in there and it would feel much, much heavier of making that increment or jump in weight. Whereas some days, such as here today, I was just, I don't know what it was. Maybe it was intuition, and intuition is based on experience, where I felt ready, I felt strong, so I was just going for it. And sometimes, to be very honest, it's not really thinking about it too much, because I don't want to come across like a smartass and be like, yeah, so I did the calculation in my head, I did that formula, and then I went into the gym and went into that machine and put the pin into here, this number. No, it was more like, okay, the machine, the stack was like 32, 36. Of course, it has this rotator for kind of micro loading, but I was way too lazy to actually use this. So I was just like taking the pin, putting it into the 36 and go for it, right? So not really overthinking it, not really questioning it, just going in there and doing the goddamn thing. And I know what it sounds like. It sounds a little bit
reckless.
Reckless and mindless. But I think that sometimes it's a good thing to know when to be like this and when not to be like this. I wouldn't really be like this on something like a free weighted deadlift or so, where it's like, all right, I'm going in there and now I'm going to increase it by 20 pounds or whatever, right? And then I'm going to wrap out the same amount of whatever. It's more, I'm going in there, and sometimes, it's like I said in the past, be more like a bro, switch out or switch off and just go for it and see what it feels like. And then the body will tell you whether you've been ready for it or not.
And forgive me if I'm wrong, but it was for a while you were doing 4-to-1 accumulation to deload paradigms, wasn't it? And then did you move to a 5-to-1 way? And I'm not saying you were set on that. It's just it tended to go that way. Yeah.
No, I think that I was more so convinced that this is what I need, and I think that this is the right way of putting things. I was convinced, and we all know a situation where we were so convinced about a specific thing that it is this what we need, without actually considering the maybe opposite side of the spectrum or a different outcome. We immediately brushed it off, like, no. It's kind of, I can think of a specific group of people who said, like, for the hack squats, I can only do or recover from 2 sets. No, you are a small natural dude and you can probably recover from more than 2 sets in an entire week. What it is that you're referring to is to those big IFBB guys who are then doing a hack squat with 300 kilograms or more. But you are a natural dude who's only hack squatting like 100 kilograms. You can recover from 2 more sets, or more than 2 sets in a week. And that is basically also what probably applied to me when it comes to the deload, that I was too stuck and too convinced that this is what I need. And now I just also were, and I think it helped that I was always getting sick, that I needed to be more flexible.
Yeah.
Of like, okay, I'm now taking the deloads whenever I feel sick. And perhaps that was the trigger that I needed in order to open up my mind for this, for me personally. For my athletes, I was already kind of very open-minded. Whenever there was a time where we needed to extend it, or the spreadsheet said that it's probably a good idea to extend it, then I did it. But from me, myself, I was so convinced of like, okay, this is my routine, this is my schedule, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think we all kind of go through that. I've certainly had various things like that where, again, like exercise selection, I would be changing things every mesocycle at one point. It's just like, what? Why did you do that, Steve? I just convinced that was the way I should do things. Versus now we actually just listen to our bodies, which is the experience there, which is really important.
How long are your typical mesocycles now? It's more like 5-1, isn't it?
Yeah, they've been pretty much 5-1 for, I don't know, like years now almost. They've been almost always, they work out that way. Very rarely can I push it for longer. I normally have to manipulate something to push it for longer. And very rarely do I have to cut it short. They typically always fall that way, which is good. And it makes sense that you fall into a pattern once you do understand where you are, because like we're robots. Most of our days are the same. So if people's are all over the shop, I'm kind of like, well, they must have a pretty hectic lifestyle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also, to be honest, when it comes to a 5-1 paradigm or 6-1 paradigm, I think that this is probably a very good length. And if you then need more than this, I think that you just need to ramp up the intensity a little bit more, because then you will eventually hit the point where you need that deload. I have a very hard time imagining to be able or needing having accumulated some fatigue and then needing another 3 weeks of just pushing to 1 and 0 RER and not needing a deload. If you don't, chances are that you're not really pushing to that 0 RER. At least from a psychological perspective, because I think it's just psychologically so demanding to push to that true 0 RER on several sets for 1 or 2 weeks. I find it very gruesome, basically, sometimes even to think about it.
Yeah, that's where I get to, where it's week 4 is like, holy shit, I think I have maybe another rep on most things, and I do the final week, I'm like, fuck yeah, I had 1 rep. And then I'm like, I can't imagine doing this for another week. It would be torturous. The only way I could see that is maybe if your volume was real low, but then if I was at that lower volume, I'd be like, well, I don't know, I'm just doing a lower volume to be able to train for more time. I don't know. Maybe it works itself out over the long run. I'm not sure, but I think maybe not. You were keeping your set volume static, right?
Yeah, exactly. Simply because I'm under the opinion that it makes things way easier to track. Secondary, I think that the volume that you're accumulating is way too aggressive. Because if you really think about it, let's say one set on a hack squat is kind of 10 repetitions. Then you are adding 10 more repetitions in one go. And that is a lot that you're then adding, which doesn't really represent a true progression if you really think about it. If you, though, on the other hand, you're able over the time span of a couple of weeks, able to then do 10 more repetitions on the sets, maybe, then you know that you've progressed by 10 repetitions and not just added something to the mix. You know what I mean? Also, I am very much kind of in the same or under the same opinion, such as Eric Helms, for example, that often it just means that you have gotten better at handling that type of volume, and you're just better from a stamina perspective of dealing with those situations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have gotten stronger or that you had necessarily much more muscular adaptations or so. Furthermore, I think that if you are progressing via the RER system over those weeks, adding sets is just also there becoming more of a burden. Because if you start things off with 4 RER with the lower volumes and then ramping things up both at the same time, so RER drops and volume increases, it doesn't really make any kind of significant sense to me, because that would mean that what it is that you need in week number 1 is so much significantly lower from an MEV perspective, for example, than your MRV. And I have a very, very hard time that to imagine that the gap and the difference is so huge for the vast majority of people. And if you are just progressing via RER, which has been shown to be the case for nearly all of my athletes, they will eventually get to the point after 5 weeks or so, sometimes earlier, sometimes a little bit later, where they need a deload. without adding the sets. And thinking about it then, if you were to go in there and need now to do, instead of 2 sets on the hack squats in the first week with 4 aria, now in the last week doing 5 sets with 1 aria, it would be so freaking brutal. And many people, they lose kind of the motivation and the drive after a couple of mesocycles, and they start to hate the process the deeper you are in the mesocycle. And I also don't think that this is a positive thing then. So many things why I like to keep the set number static, because from a psychological and physiological perspective, it just, to me, makes way more sense to progress while letting the RARs drop. And if you're then not getting to the point of then of a deload, then you can still add another week of really pushing it to 1 to 0 aria, and often that's all you need. If you were to though ramp up the sets, once again, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
I am not that far in terms of keeping sets, and I'm sure you're not like dogmatic in that. I always keep sets static no matter what. It's like you would change them if something needed changing, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But I'm far more towards that end, because what I found is thinking that sets needed to go up. Like that was always a thought in my mind. And this is with myself and athletes, like sets should be going up. But then what ends up happening is quite often people's 3 or 4 RAR isn't appropriate. And so they're not quite training hard enough. So then, yes, they are recovered enough and not feeling like they're getting enough out of their sessions from the amount of volume they're doing. So then you do add more sets because you think they're at 3 or 4 RAR maybe, or they think they are, or I thought I was. So you add sets. So you're currently undershooting intensity and overdoing volume at this point. So you do ramp it up, and then you do get to that final week where you're like, maybe, I don't know, you've doubled your volume, but you're now trying to go to naught RAR, but you've got way too much work to be able to do. So you're not really pushing the intensity. So what I found is getting that intensity right in week 1 and then letting the RARs drop, that stimulus side in terms of auto-regulating, whether maybe you want to add any more stimulus, and that's kind of the way I look at it now, is more stimulus than volume. It often takes care of itself by just dropping RAR, or rather, not even thinking about dropping RAR, but just by increasing a rep or a bit of load. Often that's enough to maintain the stimulus that you want for growth. You don't have to add. And so normally I might move from 8 to 10 sets for an exercise versus in the past, I might have been 8 to 16. It's like, man, you're doing a lot of work in the gym, but it's not efficient work because you're just not, your quality is not there.
Let me talk through when I add sets, to give a little bit of nuance and context to it as well, so that it doesn't really come across like dogmatic. In one scenario, I'm adding sets when you're coming from an active rest period, for example, or something like a prana phase, where you've resensitized yourself enough so that the first week of a mesocycle, or maybe the first 1 to 2 weeks, you're so resensitized that if you were to do the normal amounts of volume, you would just be ending up crippling sore. Pulling back, doing what it is that is needed or required and sensible, basically, is what is then needed. And then over the next weeks, we know that you are quickly adapting. We know that then the amount of metabolic disruption that you are inducing, that is then leaving you left in a rear chair or so, is actually then diminishing. And then we are ramping things up ever so gradually. The other scenario where I like to add some sets is when someone is telling me, after having gone through an entire mesocycle, and this is very important to me because I want to see how they respond to then dropping the aria and really nailing the quality and all that kind of stuff. If they still tell me, like after an entire mesocycle, hey, this muscle group, I always had the feeling that I could do a little bit more. I always felt that it was productive in the session. I never really felt that junk volume occurred. And also, by the end of the day or the next day, I was feeling actually already quite fresh, and they have the time for it. They are not overdoing it, and they may benefit from it from a stimulus perspective, where it's not just like insane amount of volume per session because the session already is so long. Then I could see adding something. And then we were also talking about maybe adding 1 or 2 sets for the entire mesocycle on a specific body part. So let's just say sometimes I like to have bicep work on the leg days as well. And often, so that it's not too systemically fatiguing, I like to then do it on a preacher machine curl. Just sitting down, right? It doesn't really require like a huge stability on your entire legs and also the upper body. You just sit down, squeeze in, and then do it. On those days, though, I often prescribe only 2 sets. However, if it turns out that that individual still has some oomph, not for the legs though anymore, but they could see themselves enough oomph for then the curls for 1 additional set, then sure, let's go for it. For example, but once again, I always want to make sure that the quality is very much there.
Yeah.
Having gone through an entire mesocycle to really be able to tell, are we getting enough productive work done by the things that we are doing right now? Everything that we're adding on top should be beneficial and shouldn't just come from wanting to do more. Yeah. And it should give us plenty of rewards and not just like, I don't know, if I can get 1% out of more out of it, is that really enough to justify an entire set where you're then doing 10 more repetitions for maybe then 1% of more? Often it isn't. Often it's then better to solely focus on adding 1 more repetition or some load over a longer period of time. And you will then probably still get the 1% and even more.
Yeah, I think the key thing that you talked about in terms of doing it after an active rest or primer, and I think I'd potentially say you might see this with if you change put in a new exercise or something, like for example, like a lunge. You haven't done lunges in ages. Yes. You might start at 1 set, but then 1 set is not enough after 1 week. Yes. You can do 2 very comfortably. And it's basically situations where you're adapting very quickly. Yeah. And like you mentioned with clients, an example of this is Mike Chalice, and we're forever trying to work back his volume. For the longest time we've been trying to do that. There's some people, he is very adaptable. Like we'll do a primer phase, he'll be able to get away with low volume for like a week or 2, and he's like, Steve, I don't feel like I'm fucking really doing very much. He won't swear. I'm swearing for him. He's like, and I know him well enough that he works incredibly hard. His quality is really high. It's like some people, and I think it's more the exception than the rule, just seem to be very adaptable. I'm like, okay, if you really feel like you need another set here, let's go for another one. But it's under that presumption, like you said, the quality is there.
Yeah, I have
if the quality ain't there.
One athlete of mine who's like this as well. And for that individual, we are also making set progression through the mesocycle. Because the first week is productive. Yeah. We kept it static sometime in the past. And we've just realized that on a weekly basis, he is capable of recovering so well on a weekly basis that he could do more. And also, it doesn't end up in junk volume. And he is also happy to do more and spend more time in the gym. Yeah. And he doesn't really get burned out by it. Yeah. Right? So, but this is, like you said, very much the exception. This is one athlete out of a lot of athletes over the past year.
The more I've shot for, actually, this is probably not enough time to talk about it on this podcast, but I coach Jake Reed from RP. Yeah. He just brought it up the last check-in that we had. He was like, we were talking about volume and kind of the volume landmarks and things. He was like, actually, the way I think maybe a better term for it could be stimulus. And I think I actually said to you this in a voice note, maybe, I'm not sure, or I was speaking it to another athlete. And I was like, actually, thinking about stimulus, I much prefer that in many ways because like your volume over time could come down because your quality could improve and your intensity improves, or you use more loads as more advanced athlete, but your stimulus isn't coming down. And that's because stimulus is a little bit distinct from volume. And I think it's a volume is like hard sets. It's easy to quantify, whereas stimulus, it's like, it's a bit of a nebulous term, and it's something for maybe advanced athletes to think about because they can actually identify local muscle fatigue and pump disruption and progression a bit more clearly. But that's why I like thinking about stimulus. And once I started thinking more about stimulus, I was less focused on, I should be adding sets because I want to move from MEV to MRV. And I was more focused on, I want to maintain, like get a good stimulus, maintain that for as long as possible. And then once it starts possibly dropping off or the person can't recover anymore, that's when we deload, resensitize the stimulus, and then we introduce the stimulus again and then build it up maybe across the weeks and try and maintain a good stimulus. Yeah. And that kind of has fundamentally changed how I approach progression through a mesocycle for myself and clients. And I think it's definitely made people more efficient, if anything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you always need to think about the concepts of MRV and MEV and all that kind of stuff, I very much like it because it did put a concept to the entire thing. The thing is, though, that too many people take it as a static approach. The thing is, though, that those are moving targets all the time. That's why I think it's futile to figure out what your MEV, MRV, and all that kind of stuff is, because you will never figure it out. And once you think that you have it figured out, it has already changed again, because everything else in your life is on a move as well. Nothing is a constant when it comes to those things that impact those numbers. That's why it doesn't really matter, or it doesn't really make any kind of sense to track those things, because once you have those numbers and you make 1 or 2 changes to the program, those numbers are out of the window again and you're starting from scratch. So I really like your approach of like, okay, listening more so to the stimulus. And even if it's not a clear metric that you can track, it's probably much more telling just starting to listen to your body again, instead of putting down some arbitrary numbers that then are kind of being not even usable in the future anymore. That's
why people are like you can't compare a set of leg extensions to a set of leg press or back squats, but they're all a set for the quads. It's like, well, then if you're not doing leg extensions or you are doing them in your program, the volume between two people is like completely it's completely useless. Totally. So I've had clients where their set volumes come down over time, and then they're concerned because they're like, surely that should be going up over time. Like, but your stimulus is what we're trying to get, like that we're giving to the muscle, not a particular amount of volume. So completely on the same page. Cool.
Then I think we're coming up on time here.
Yes.
And I have to go to pee again. It's the monster from the first episode. And Kayo is nicely asleep now.
Oh,
At the beginning of the first episode, he was already jumping around and stuff like this. He's very nicely asleep.
He's calmed down.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, guys, I'm going to close off this one because Pascal did the last one. As always, thank you very much for listening. And like Pascal said last time, we are in process of transitioning this improvement season over to its own kind of podcast platform in a sense. So if you are wanting to keep up to date with that, definitely keep listening and make sure to have an eye out for that. And if you enjoy these enjoy these episodes, please do share it with anyone you think might enjoy it. Give us a like, give us a nice review, give us some feedback. That's always welcome. Just give us a comment. Any interaction is beneficial, even if it's a dislike. We like it all, to be honest. And if you have any questions you particularly kind of want covered, or you have any questions after this episode, please just drop us a line. Otherwise, I guess we'll speak to you next week.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers, guys.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut Movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut Movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.